Welcome to the Causes or Cures podcast, your gateway to understanding health and groundbreaking medical research in a fun and easy to understand way. With Dr. Eeks as your host, join us as we sit down with the world's leading doctors and scientists to unravel the mysteries of health. From practical tips on well-being to the latest breakthroughs in medical research, we cover it all. Don't forget to subscribe. Now, let's ignite our curiosity and together dive into today's episode.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in for the Causes or Cures podcast today. I'm Dr. Eeks, your host, and I hope everyone is doing well out there. A couple of updates before we dive into today's episode. So the newsletter. I will be adding written interviews to my newsletter with researchers doing cool stuff all around the world. So I hope you consider subscribing because I'm reaching out to researchers doing things that I think you guys will care about, things that will improve your health or things that you'll read and be like, oh, wow, that's cool. So that will be in the next newsletter. So subscribe now. That link is in the show notes and you won't miss it. And for those who asked about podcast sponsorships or working with me to help tell your scientific story, that whole realm of sci-coms that deserves to be more creative. And I love to be creative. Please email me, Erin@bloomingwellness.com, and we can talk about your project and see if I can help, if I'm a fit or not. All right. Also, stay tuned for bonus podcast episodes. Bonus episodes. These will be available to everyone, and they're going to be fun, bizarre, and entertaining stories related to public health. Hopefully stories you'll find intriguing. And then they will just be me telling the stories. So sorry if you don't like my voice. I can't do much to change it. I guess I could. I could tell them in my dog voice. My dog sounds like Cartman, and maybe I'll let him talk on the podcast one day, but that also might get me committed. I am aware of that. But I have voices. I have voices, okay? Anyhow, moving on to today's topic. You ready? Are you feeling itchy? You might be, because today we are going to talk about mosquitoes. And not just any mosquito Joe Schmo, but we will be talking about gene drive mosquitoes with the director of the Gene Convene Global Collaborative, Dr. Michael Santos. And the reason you guys should stay and listen to this one is because they are going to start doing field trials with gene drive mosquitoes very soon. And he's going to talk more about that timeline in the podcast and when you can expect those trials to happen. So as a really quick breakdown on what we'll cover in the podcast, Dr. Santos will tell us what makes gene drive mosquitoes unique and what sets them apart from genetically modified mosquitoes, or why, they're a little different, and why you guys should care about that. He'll talk about some of the risks of gene drive mosquitoes as well as the benefits. He'll talk about how these field trials will be approved, monitored, and regulated, which is really important given this type of technology. And I think it'll be interesting to you guys, who want to know how this process and the regulation all works. He'll discuss community involvement, like these mosquitoes will be released somewhere. What say does the community have in all of that? And he'll talk about his own feelings on gene drive mosquitoes. And perhaps after you guys listen to this, you'll have your own opinions that you'll want to share along with the link to this podcast. Shameless promotion there. But yeah, it would be interesting because this is a controversial topic for a lot of people. So I think it would be interesting after you guys listen to this and share your own thoughts and ideas on social media. And if you do, let me know because I'm curious what people think after they listen to this. All right, gang, give me a few seconds here while we connect to Dr. Santos. All right, everyone, we are connecting with Dr. Michael Santos, and we are going to hear about gene drive mosquito technology and where they're at with that. But Dr. Santos, I know you were on Causes or Cures before, a very interesting topic. about a life-saving antibiotic and sepsis. But can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, remind them who you are and what we're gonna, the work that you're doing, which ties into our topic today?
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me back. It's a delight to be chatting again. So I am Michael Santos. I am the Senior Vice President for Science Partnerships at the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, a nonprofit foundation that supports the mission of the NIH. I'm also the director of the Gene Convene Global Collaborative, which is an initiative of the FNIH that supports informed decision making about genetic biocontrol approaches like gene drives for public health applications like preventing the transmission of malaria.
All right. And I know people have heard of genetically modified mosquitoes and may have some idea what those are. But our focus today is on gene drive mosquitoes. So can you explain to our listeners in as simple as you can, what are gene drive mosquitoes and how are they different or what distinguishes them from genetically modified mosquitoes?
I'd be happy to. So, for a long time, about 100 years, it's been known that in nature there are genes and genetic elements that have this property that's called selfish, that they have mechanisms that they use to cause them to be more common in the offspring of an organism than they would be without those selfish genetic mechanisms. So they find a way to either make it into more of the offspring than they otherwise would, or set up a system such that the offspring that don't inherit this trait don't survive or don't do as well. And so that observation in nature for a long time has motivated the idea that maybe these selfish genetic elements that exhibit this property called gene drive, meaning they're more common in the offspring than you would otherwise expect, maybe that phenomenon could be engineered, and specifically engineered to control, say, the kinds of mosquitoes that transmit malaria, or say other insects that transmit other diseases or cause other problems in the environment. And so this is a very old idea, but the technology advances in genetic editing and genetic engineering that have taken place over the last sort of 20-ish years have really enabled people to begin to implement these ideas in the mosquitoes that transmit malaria. And about 10 years ago, using this tool called CRISPR-Cas, which is one of the newer genetic engineering tools to become available, a number of researchers were able to demonstrate that they could cause this phenomenon of gene drive in these mosquitoes. So they introduced a genetic element, and then mosquitoes that carried that genetic element, almost all of their offspring also have it, and then their offspring also have it. And so if you put a few of these mosquitoes in a cage with a few mosquitoes that have been genetically engineered this way, in a cage with a bunch of other mosquitoes that don't have it, and then you watch generation after generation after generation, you see the percentage of the mosquitoes that are carrying this genetic change increases and increases, and in many cases reaches 100% of the mosquitoes in the cage. So that phenomenon is called gene drive, and it can be used not just to carry the gene drive, but to carry another change along with it, a change that would either reduce the fertility of the mosquitoes, so reduce their populations, or change, say, the immune system of the mosquito in a way that would stop it from transmitting the malaria parasite. And so those ideas are ones that are being pursued now by many research groups with the intent of ultimately being able to prevent the spread of diseases like malaria.
Okay. So the engineered trait gets passed along to the offspring, basically. And that's
That's right.
not, and so like, and with genetically modified, that's not the case or not, basically.
Yeah, so the
Okay.
broader world of genetic modification
Yeah.
includes all different kinds of things. So it can include genetically modifying organisms in ways that are typically passed on to offspring, but not in a way where it will necessarily increase. Or you can genetically modify organisms in ways where they won't have any offspring at all. You can create, say, genetically sterile mosquitoes, this is something that has been accomplished as well, so that when those mosquitoes mate with wild mosquitoes, there's just no offspring. And that's a different way to try to control the population of mosquitoes.
Okay, and we're going to get back to malaria and the scope of that problem and what's available now to fight it and why this is needed. But just when people hear gene drive, it sounds like okay, you're going to make mosquitoes do something that's permanent. And we can think about the benefits of that, but you also might think that this is irreversible then, right? Like if you let these mosquitoes go out into the wild. So I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure, scientists have to consider these things. What are the risks to releasing genetically modified gene drive mosquitoes into a population? And what are the things that you guys are considering?
Yes, so because this gene drive is achieved through genetic modification, that means that the laws and regulations that govern genetically modified organisms govern these kinds of approaches. And so, generally speaking, although different countries do it a little differently, countries have regulations about what's called biological safety or biosafety that applies to genetically modified organisms. And so part of that process is a environmental risk assessment. So asking the question, beginning with the key sort of what are called protection goals, the key values that a society holds that are encoded in their laws and regulations, things like protecting human health, protecting animal health, conserving biodiversity, preserving ecosystem services. And then so takes those and then asks if we, if it were the case that a specific proposal, say for the release of mosquitoes modified with a gene drive, were approved, what could the possible risks associated with that be? So you ask, what are the different pathways that we could envision from the proposed action, say the release of these mosquitoes, to a harmful consequence to something like human health or animal health? And so a lot of work goes into identifying those different potential pathways to harm and then evaluating the probability of those different pathways happening. So attempting to assess based on laboratory experiments or computer studies or experience in other domains, how likely these different pathways are to occur, so how big the risks are, and then also, of course, looks at the consequences. Another part of that, like you said, because there is the intention with many of these gene driver approaches for them to persist in the environment, and also they have the capability to spread between populations of mosquitoes that are breeding with each other. So another question is what kind of risk management is possible? So for the different potential risks, if they were to occur, what kinds of interventions could you take to mitigate those harms? And so that entire process of assessing risk and considering risk management, and then the third part is communicating openly about the risk assessment and the risk management approaches. That's all part of the regulation of these kinds of technologies that is implemented in country laws and regulations, also in international treaties like the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. And so there is this regulatory framework that very much prioritizes assessing the potential risks before anything like this was actually introduced into the environment.
Okay. And we're going to talk about when you do a trial and the types of things that you're going to look at. But just to, I know we're talking about mosquitoes, but and they have, a bad reputation, but they're also food, right, for bats and birds. And so you think about the ecosystem. And then the one thing I wanted to ask about gene drive mosquitoes before we get into the trials and how you all are regulating those, is it possible for the target mosquito to evolve resistance to the gene drive? It is.
Sure. So,
Yeah.
yeah, resistance is an important consideration essentially for any kind of control for anything that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's important for treatments for infectious diseases.
Yeah.
It's important for vaccines. It's important even for diagnostics. In the case of malaria, the parasite has evolved in some cases to eliminate one of the markers that's used commonly to diagnose malaria infection. So it's absolutely something that's important to consider. In the case of gene drive, there are different possible resistance mechanisms. One is the mosquitoes could evolve resistance to the drive mechanisms itself. The mosquitoes could evolve resistance to the genetic change that's being carried, say the interruption of mosquito fertility that's being introduced. Or in the case of making changes in the mosquito's immune system to try to prevent the malaria parasite from being transmitted, the parasite could evolve resistance to those new mechanisms that are being introduced into the mosquito. So all of these are important considerations.
Yeah.
And when the first gene drives were developed in mosquitoes, resistance in some cases was observed relatively quickly. And a lot of the work over the last 10 years from those early demonstrations until now has been to identify and implement ways to mitigate these resistance mechanisms. Almost no resistance mechanism could be, forestalled forever, but the idea would be to have interventions like this that would at least be effective for enough time to achieve significant impact on malaria. And ultimately, the goal here isn't the gene drive. The goal here is eliminating malaria. And if you say no longer have the malaria parasite circulating, then it's no longer important, whether these mechanisms continue to operate or not. So the question is, can you kind of get long enough impact with other interventions to achieve your goal before resistance mitigates your effectiveness?
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit about malaria. It kills 600,000 people per year in sub-Saharan Africa, mostly kids. And I know there's sprays, there's bed nets. I think there's a vaccine that they're rolling out in certain areas. I'm not sure how far along they are with that, but do you see a need for this type of technology given, the vaccine development, and given, the risks that you just described? How would you sell this as, hey, yes, there is a need for these types of mosquitoes?
So, first of all, looking at academic reviews of this, the World Health Organization and the African Union, all of these organizations and groups that are interested in malaria control, going back years, have looked at the state of the tools for malaria control and the resources for malaria control, and looking at those together, said these are insufficient to achieve the goals, either say of the world through WHO or of the African Union, in terms of reducing and ultimately eliminating malaria as a public health concern. You mentioned the interventions that we have, and if you look, say from 1990 through today, you see some pretty impressive reductions in malaria mortality. But then if you just look at the last several years of malaria mortality and malaria cases, you see that the progress has really stagnated, and in some cases, actually, we're even starting to see a resurgence in the number of malaria cases. And so I think there's pretty clear consensus that the combination of existing tools and resources aren't sufficient to achieve the goals. And that means innovation is important broadly. And one of those categories of innovation is genetic modification, including these gene drive approaches. And that's been recognized by WHO, by the African Union in a decision asking its development agency, AUDA-NAPAD, to support its member states to build capacity for research and regulation of these approaches. So I think this is a sort of pretty broadly recognized that new innovations are necessary, and it's great that the first two malaria vaccines are now being introduced, but it's also recognized that the tools that are available and the resources that are available combined are just evidently insufficient to continue to make the kind of progress that these countries in the world would like to see.
Okay. And I know our focus is on malaria today, but I suppose the genetically modified or gene drive mosquitoes can be targeted for other mosquito-borne illnesses, vector-borne illnesses, that kind of thing. But I guess the main focus is malaria in general.
So absolutely, it's true that this kind of approach can be used for other vector-borne diseases in general, including diseases vectored by animals other than mosquitoes. One advantage of, say, suppressing the population of mosquitoes with this approach is that the mosquitoes that vector malaria in Africa also transmit some other diseases, and so reducing their population would reduce the spread of those other diseases too. But also, researchers are explicitly working in the species of mosquitoes that transmit dengue and yellow fever and Zika and chikungunya to see whether similar approaches might be able to be applied in those mosquito species. And then, more generally, people have looked at like tick-borne diseases and other kinds of diseases that are transmitted not from human to human, but through an intermediate host. And at least in principle, in some of those cases, this could be applied. But because of the burden of malaria, as you mentioned, the 600,000 deaths a year, I think that's really motivated it as the area where the progress has advanced the furthest.
Right. And I know we're here in the US, so we don't necessarily think about those numbers, as much as maybe we should. Of course, like with the tick-borne illnesses, that's always in the news in the US with Lyme disease and even with dogs. Oh my goodness. So let's talk about, you talked a little bit about the research and how long it's been going on regarding gene-drive mosquitoes. And now it sounds like they're ready to start field trials. So I'm curious, what is the timeline for that? I know they've had trials on genetically modified mosquitoes, but they have never had a trial on gene-drive mosquitoes. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So there have been trials of genetically modified mosquitoes in different species, and including here in the U.S., in the Florida Keys. But there has never been a field trial, meaning a study that occurs outside of laboratory confinement or containment for gene drive in any organism, in mosquito or otherwise. So in terms of the research and development pathway for these approaches for malaria, that's a big next frontier. Multiple different research groups have demonstrated that, like I said, in a cage, they can take a population of mosquitoes that are similar to wild mosquitoes and introduce a small number with this change and see that it spreads. They can see that it makes the changes that they would like to see that would be able to prevent the transmission of malaria. But there's still open questions about whether, if you introduced similar mosquitoes into a natural environment, whether the same mechanisms would work or would work as well. And so that's what field trials initially would seek to test. Does the gene drive work? Do you see the genetic construct spreading the way you expect, or introducing itself into the population the way you expect? Does it persist over time? Are there different resistance mechanisms than you observed in the cage that pop up faster than you were expecting? And then, of course, also asking these environmental safety questions. Do you see impacts? Do the interactions with the environment align with the expectations that you put forward in the risk assessment? Do you learn anything there as well? So that's a big frontier. So there are multiple research groups in Africa that are evaluating sites where they could perform field trials. So part of being able to do these studies is very accurately characterizing the mosquito population and the malaria situation in the location where you would do the study, and of course also engaging with the communities there, because an important part of research is community engagement, and getting both regulatory approvals but also community agreement on moving forward with research in a location. And so in multiple different locations in West Africa and East Africa, there are research groups that are at this stage. And in terms of the timeline question, it's believed that within the next couple of years, these research groups may be ready to submit proposals to regulatory authorities for field trials. And as we talked about before any of that kind of research can happen, it requires approval by the government. So it requires the regulatory authority to evaluate the proposal, to consider the risks, as we've talked about, and decide whether or not the research can move forward, and if it can move forward under what conditions. And so we expect pretty soon to see applications go in, and then it will be up to the regulatory authorities in the countries to decide how they want to move forward from there.
And when people hear the word field trial, can you just describe, is that like a community, a village, and can you talk a little bit about what goes into, the people who would be impacted or part of this trial even? I'm not sure people could grasp that concept because I think mosquitoes are flying around everywhere. But just sort of how do you contain that? How do you get the people to buy in? And how do you keep the mosquitoes from, flying around to other places?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, imagining what a field trial looks like, we can look at field trials of genetically modified mosquitoes that have already occurred. In the case of the species of mosquitoes that transmit malaria, you can imagine somebody, well, first starting in a laboratory where the mosquitoes with the genetic modification are reared, are grown. So there's a bunch of them. And then you take some of them in a box and you take them out to a release location and you open it and they fly out. There are different possible approaches, but in many cases, researchers are considering releasing male mosquitoes. So male mosquitoes don't bite, don't transmit disease, but do, of course, mate with female mosquitoes. And that would be the pathway through which these released mosquitoes would introduce the genetic change into the population. And then after that, a standard part of mosquito research is trapping mosquitoes and then studying them. So you can trap mosquitoes in different ways. You can sort of trick female mosquitoes into flying into your trap when they're trying to find someone to bite or some place to lay their eggs. Or you can, mosquitoes begin their life as eggs that hatch in water. For these kinds of mosquitoes, usually just sort of small transient puddles. You can go ahead and scoop some of those larvae out and bring them back to your lab to study. And initially, the researchers would be looking to see whether the genetics work the way that was expected. Is the percentage of mosquitoes locally that are carrying this genetic construct increasing over time, roughly the way you would expect? And then is it persisting over time? Once it reaches a high percentage in the mosquitoes, does it stay there, or is there some unexpected mechanism that's causing it to decrease? Beyond that, as you said, also over time, this construct you would expect to spread away from the release location because mosquitoes fly. And so mosquitoes that are carrying this genetic construct can fly a little way, mate with a mosquito over there, pass it on over there, and so on. And so when people simulate this in computer models, right, they find that over time, this intervention should spread away from the release site. And so that's something else that will be looked for in the first field studies is, in addition to the persistence, whether it spreads. And then another part of the question you asked was about, so just to say that persistence and spread would be an intended effect. So people would be looking to see whether that's happening as expected or whether it's not working as expected. And then, you asked about community engagement. So part of this work that, again, begins long before the field trial is engaging with the communities, providing information, allowing opportunities for input and feedback, and collective alignment on the research proposal. And then different individuals can be involved in different ways. As I mentioned, sort of mosquito collection is an important part of this. So often community members will be in some way involved in the mosquito collection activities, where mosquitoes are collected from inside someone's home, for example. That requires the consent of the household. But other local people might just be involved in capturing mosquitoes from swarms or dipping larvae out of the larval habitats. So there are different kinds of ways for communities to get involved, in addition to their role in providing agreement or not for research moving forward there.
So getting back to the concept of, or what you just said, that the goal in a field trial is, the spread to get the benefit of reducing malaria and keeping people alive ultimately, right? That's like the end goal, so that you don't want people to get malaria and die. My question is, with a genetically modified mosquito, if something goes wrong in a field trial, you can just stop releasing the genetically modified mosquitoes or kill them somehow. But I'm just curious, like with the gene drive, can you stop that if something goes wrong or unexpected, or like, uh-oh, you're like, that's not great, just because that's supposed to, affect the offspring? Or is that harder to stop if something goes wrong versus genetically modified?
Yeah. So part of the question would be exactly what happens. But generally, again, looking at these different possible risks and asking, what are the risks that could occur? And then how would you manage the different risks? So one way of managing risks sometimes might be to try to remove the mosquitoes that carry the genetic modification from the environment, which in some cases may be possible to do with conventional vector control tools. So with intensive use of the kinds of insecticides that are used currently to control the populations of these mosquitoes in these communities. So that would be one possibility. Now, if it turns out that the mosquitoes have spread geographically far beyond the initial release site, the more that occurs, then the more difficult and more costly it would be to use conventional means. But part of it would be to understand, well, exactly what is the harm that is being caused, and some of the ways of mitigating that harm might not actually require directly mitigating the presence of the mosquitoes, right? There may be other things that could be done to manage an unexpected harm. So it's very much dependent on exactly what happens. This is why monitoring and surveillance is important. This is why any of these regulatory approvals will include provisions for monitoring for unexpected things that could happen, and will include risk management plans of how to respond to those. But the fact that the gene drive mosquitoes are intended to persist and spread is different than some other interventions. It's not different from something like what's called classical biological control, where you say introduce a natural predator of an invasive species to try to control it. That's also something that is generally intended to persist and spread and has been seen in many cases, including spreading across national borders. So there are other interventions that have some of these same properties where experience can be drawn upon, but the intersection of that property with the genetic modification is different for gene drive than for other approaches.
Right. And that's a great point, because that certainly has happened, and people may not think about that when we're talking about, genetically modified or gene drive mosquitoes, because I mean, to people, there's like this sci-fi, element too, like everyone's like, oh, what could go wrong? Or, if you're poking the dragon, if you're messing with nature too much. But what would you say to that person who has that fear? Like, oh, don't mess with nature too much. Someone who's just listening to this podcast and, worried maybe that we're poking the dragon.
Yeah, so of course, overall, I think we should be very interested and very concerned about humanity's interaction with nature, right? We have altered the natural environment in a lot of ways to achieve different goals. And, that has resulted in plenty of benefits for humanity, but also in some consequences for biodiversity and for other things that are important to us, including ecosystem services that we depend on from the environment. So in general, of course, I share the concern that I hope everybody has about humans and our interactions with nature. And that's why it's important that there are laws and regulations and policies and regulators, individuals who are responsible for assessing these risks and making determinations about whether or not the risks are acceptable or not. In this particular case, ultimately whether these interventions are used will depend to some degree on calculus involving benefits, risks, and costs. And as further research potentially provides more information about the relative magnitudes of those different factors, that will help inform decision making about this. And I mean, it's also why it's important for for governance to be local, for the countries involved to be making these decisions, because the mosquitoes that transmit malaria in Africa live in many different African countries, but actually generally not outside of Africa. So, as the regional economic communities of the different countries, as the African Union as a whole, evaluate the potential benefits, the potential risks, the associated costs, and make decisions, they're doing it in a holistic context that includes both, their value, of course, for minimizing risks to biodiversity, but also, their value of addressing an important social problem in malaria. So, that's I think risk assessment is really important for innovative technologies, and is something that's really key. And it's just important overall to have good governance in place, so that these decisions can be made in an informed way. And, that's a big part of what we try to support.
Right, right. I mean, and I think when people, just as like if we're talking about, a vaccine or in a virus, people need to consider the risk of whatever it is you're fighting too. And sometimes that gets lost in these conversations because there's a lot of fear about new things and new technologies. But then there's also, well, you're 600,000 people a year are dying of this, right? So that's a lot of people. So I think that's something that everyone has to remember, whenever we're talking about these types of things. And I think Gene Convene, you had a really great infographic, which I think that's available to the public. But I thought it was great, and it kind of goes through everything that's involved with a field trial, right? And regulations in place. Is that, maybe you could talk a little bit about that for anyone who might be interested?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and delighted to hear that that you enjoyed it. So I mentioned our goal at Gene Convene is to support informed decision making about these technologies. We're not involved in developing them. We're not involved in regulating them, right? Our goal is to support informed decision making by the organizations that are involved in the research and development, and by the stakeholders that are involved in governance, which is many different stakeholders, both decision makers, but also different groups that have input into those processes. And one of our goals was to help anyone, and as you say, this is publicly available, anyone who wants to understand how does governance work for something like a field trial of gene drives, have more insight into that. I think it's pretty common to imagine that there are researchers working on this, and then people think like, oh, well, do just the researchers decide whether they release these mosquitoes or not? Not very many people are knowledgeable about biosafety governance globally. So it's something that we just wanted to create, hopefully a really accessible resource for people who want to just understand, okay, well, what are the different steps? Like, how could you imagine this playing out? It's hypothetical, but it's based on real mechanisms that exist. What's the role of the research institution? What's the role of the national government? What are the obligations of the researchers? What role does the community play? And just kind of laying it all out in a little illustrated story, so that hopefully at the end, people have a better grasp on how all these pieces, what all these pieces are, and how they all fit together.
Yeah, and it is accessible, and I appreciate that you guys put that together. And I'll share the link for my listeners if they want to look at it too, because I think people are interested in this, and I think there's a lot of people are in the dark in terms of what actually happens and the safety things that are in place, and just for anybody who wants to know, they can find out. I was curious. You mentioned that the genetically modified mosquito, there's been field trials going on with those. What is the general scientific consensus about those? Have people been satisfied with the results? Was there anything alarming that happened in any trial that people were like, oh gosh, don't do that again? Just curious if you could tell our listeners a little bit about, those and what people are thinking about those that are already ongoing.
Yes, yeah, I'd be happy to. So most of the studies that have occurred with genetically modified mosquitoes have been in the genus of mosquitoes called Aedes, which are the ones that are responsible for transmitting dengue and yellow fever and Zika and chikungunya. And so those have happened in several different countries at the research stage. And in Brazil, those are actually approved for commercial use. So people who live in Brazil can go online and order genetically modified mosquitoes. They will be delivered to their home. They will get desiccated, so dried out eggs that they add water to, and genetically modified mosquitoes will hatch and fly into the environment. And those mosquitoes are modified with a trait that will reduce the population of mosquitoes locally that transmit those diseases. So that's an example where this approach has been through research and development and regulatory approval and is now available for use. In Africa, with the species of mosquitoes that transmit malaria, there has so far been, with species of mosquitoes that transmit malaria, there are two different places, both Burkina Faso and Djibouti, where field trials of genetically modified mosquitoes that are either sterile or similar to sterile to reduce the population have occurred or are ongoing. And so in both of those cases, these are early pilot studies. So the goal is to sort of lead to better scientific understanding that could inform, in one case, subsequent development of eventually gene-drive mosquitoes, and in the other case, an application similar to the applications that's used in Brazil for those kinds of mosquitoes that could be used for one of the species of mosquitoes that's recently made its way into Africa that can also transmit malaria. So it's very early days in the malaria application, but a little bit more advanced for preventing some of these other diseases. And but I think from a scientific perspective and from a kind of operational perspective and from a governance perspective, right? From, going through this process of an application and review and decision, these studies have demonstrated the ability of this research to move forward in a regulated way.
I didn't know that. So you could actually order genetically modified mosquitoes to your house if you live in Brazil.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow. Not in the United States. So we're not.
That's right. They didn't. There's been research, as we said, in the United States, but not application for regulatory approval for commercialization yet.
And that trial in the United States in Florida, that had to go through similar regulatory framework, right?
So that trial, which is conducted by a company called Oxitec, which is also the company that makes these mosquitoes available in Brazil and is doing the study in Djibouti. The U.S. Has a somewhat different regulatory system than many countries in the world regarding this. But that study in Oxitec, multiple different regulators at the state and federal level were involved in reviewing the application and making the decision to approve that.
All right. Well, I think you gave a great summary, and I think folks can certainly, if they're interested in learning more, I will include the link to the infographic. And how do you feel about this philosophically? Are you excited about it? Do you have concerns, or are you what are your thoughts?
So I'm certainly excited that there is innovation for new tools that could potentially be transformative in the ability of countries to control malaria. I mean, it's a concerning situation looking at the fact that there hasn't really been any progress in reducing deaths due to malaria, that actually malaria cases are increasing, that resources for malaria control are likely to decline. And at the same time, existing tools like, as you mentioned before, bed nets that are treated with insecticides to protect people sleeping under them. Over time, mosquitoes become resistant to the insecticides. There are new insecticides, which is great, but they typically cost a little more than the previous insecticides. So at a time when resources are reducing, it becomes even more difficult to even maintain the status quo, much less reduce this horrific incident of a child dying every minute due to malaria. So I'm very pleased that there's innovation. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to contribute, hopefully, to informed decision making about that innovation, to strengthen the governance systems, to inform the developers that are working on these technologies. Because at the end of the day, what we want is good decision making, and we want the capacity to be in place for good governance, and that's the pathway through which we see access to innovation really being sort of more globally disseminated. Ensuring that you have strong governance enables your country to make decisions for itself, weighing potential benefits, risks, and costs, right? And so I'm very grateful for the role that that we play with partners in strengthening those systems, and hopefully leading to informed decision making about these innovative tools that have the potential to have a real transformative impact, on this terrible health burden.
All right. Well, thank you. And I appreciate that you're transparent about it all and, everything that people have to consider and all the players involved, just because, I don't think a lot of listeners just don't know, all of that, the backstory. So I think just shining a light on it is really important. So thanks so much for coming on today. And I will share all those links so folks can check it out if they want to.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate your work. As you say, not everyone, knows, especially that there are resources. We have the Gene Convene Virtual Institute, which has tons and tons of frequently asked questions that come up in this area. It's absolutely our desire to make this information as widely known and accessible as possible. Yeah. And really appreciate your commitment to helping inform people about science and governance and these really important topics.
Yeah, absolutely. I always learn something too when someone comes on the podcast like yourself. So it's fun too. But thanks so much, Dr. Santos. Appreciate it.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Maybe some mosquitoes even joined in. Wouldn't that be weird if they're listening to this episode? So what do you guys think of gene drive mosquitoes? Are you excited, nervous? You're like, what the heck? Please share your thoughts on social media or email me and let me know, Erin@bloomingwellness.com. And the link to the infographic we discussed in the podcast will be in the show notes. And it is a really great job. I don't know who did it or who made it, but it's well done. And I think it kind of takes everything we talked about in this podcast and puts it in this picture. It's telling a story through a diagram and a picture that's easy to digest. So take a look at that. And if you hit the support icon, you can also be a part of the Science Story Magic. And if you become a supporter, you can come to the first live Zoom party where it's like a party for nerds, probably, but that's okay. But we will shoot the shit for a good hour, maybe longer if you're free. We'll see. And there's going to be like an agenda of topics, but I'll put that out before the date. And then there'll be an RSVP just so I know who's coming. And if you want to work together to put some magic in your own science story, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, just message me, Erin@bloomingwellness.com. And maybe, just maybe, we can work together. I have a couple spaces open and a great team, a small team, but everyone is super competent, efficient, creative, and great with deadlines. I can't work with people who are not good with deadlines. I don't know if that makes me type A or it's a side effect of West Point, my alma mater, but it's true. It's weird because I used to have detention a lot in high school because I was late all the time. Father Clotton, how you doing? I used to have to sit after school. Oh gosh, that was the good old days. All right. I liked Father Clotton actually. My family used to babysit his parrot Murph, and Murph had a mouth on him. Man, he would curse. He would say F you and all sorts of things. It was great. And I taught him how to say my name. And every time the phone rang, he would call my name. But then sometimes he would say F you, Erin, because he would combine, the words that he knew together. Anyways, that's a long story, but rest in peace, Murph. You were You were cut from a different cloth. All right. And now it's time for the closing quotes. This one is from Andy Warhol, and here it is. The mosquito is the state bird of New Jersey. Okay, that's hilarious. And no offense to anyone in New Jersey, there are some nice parts of New Jersey. Truly, there are. I've been there with my travel soccer team way back when. New Jersey gets a bad rap. And here's another quote, just to be inclusive for the New Jerseyans. And this one doesn't have a specific attribution. It's attributed, it's attributed to Southern humor. So I guess like the bless your heart humor. All right, so here it is. Some people are like mosquitoes. They don't do much, but they sure can ruin a perfectly good evening. Yeah, we all know those mosquito people. All right. That's it for today. I hope you join in next time. Subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to the show so you don't miss future episodes. And that's it. Go out there and have a great day. Goodbye for now.